So last week we talked about the media in regard to the ice baths thing.
Yep, the sensationalism versus the facts.
Yeah. And following on from that, I think that's a nice launching point for us to talk about stretching, because an article came out last week saying basically you should.
Yeah, we go around circles a bit. It's like,
because it's a nuanced issue.
Yeah.
But the fundamental is studies have not proven stretching helps.
Yep.
Therefore, you should probably not bother. And one of the great quotes was, "You probably need to stretch for 6 years in order to not have one injury." Is the quote.
And the big thing that they have in the stretching arguments is that a lot of the studies look at acute effects and the effect of stretching immediately before, say, a sprint or an agility test or a vertical leap test, and they show significant reduction in power, up to like 4 to 8% type stuff. And that's, if you're talking about a 100-meter sprinter, that is a significant difference. But it's the nuance of the issue that's of concern.
And so 10 years ago, I would have people arguing with me that I should stop all of our athletes stretching. And it was questioned at WBL level what I was doing with stretching, because we shouldn't be doing it. 10 years later, 12 years later, with the exception of one athlete, 0 games missed a soft tissue injury in 12 seasons of professional sport. And we've been stretching and it's worked out just fine. And that's anecdotal, that doesn't have power, but it's
still a thing. Last night, one of our athletes, Zoe, asked me about the Nordic stuff, because we did the Nordic episode a couple of weeks ago. Asked me about Nordics and hamstrings. She said, "But we don't have any, like, you don't train many footballers." I said, "We train a few, we have a few footballers and soccer players." And she said, "But, like, no hamstrings?" And I said, "Yeah, like, because of the doing the thing, like, just because..."
Hopefully, it's not touch wood.
And it's like, yeah, so like our low soft tissue injury rate, I think, is very significantly put down to the fact that we stretch all our athletes before a session.
Yeah, because the acute thing of short little bout, do a lot of stretching in a short amount of time at a kind of high intensity, like kind of pushing the stretches.
In the studies, yeah.
Yeah, because they have to get a result. So let's circle back to the 0-0 draw terror that every scientist feels.
Yeah, so in science, you kind of live on a loop, and I'll link to a couple of videos on the topic of scientific research. And why it is a great method of learning things, but it's also not the best. Because when you're a scientist or studying or doing research, if you don't get a result from 6 months of funding and 6 months of work, and you end up with, you've kind of wasted a lot of people's time and a lot of people's money.
And you're not necessarily going to be first in line for research grants.
Next time around, exactly.
Yeah.
So when you set up your study...
Publish or perish is the academic saying. Yeah.
So in that setting, you want to set up your study to make sure it's publishable. So if... I wonder if stretching affects power. Well, let's just crank up the stretches and do it immediately before the power exercise and see what happens.
Because the worst thing you can get is the 0-0 draw. So how do you get away from that? Well, you magnify the input, and the further you magnify that input, the further you move away from validity, because it's less and less real world. So it's more reliable.
Because you can repeat that again and again and again, get that result.
But fundamentally less valid, because it's just not real world. And so there was like a decade of studies showing that you shouldn't have people stretch.
And so some of my favourites are they would do a stretch of the quad, the hamstring, the glutes, and the calves, and they hold each stretch for like 2 minutes. Yeah. So 2 minutes, 2 minutes. So it's like 15 minutes of stretching. And then immediately post that,
the second you finish,
like you'd get up from the last calf stretch, transition into the vertical leap test, and you do a max effort vertical jump.
Yeah.
And always it's like a 4, 5, 6, 7% drop, which is 3 or 4 centimeters. It's a considerable amount.
Yeah.
And then, so the headline would be "Stretching reduces athletic power when done before exercise."
And people would people would be acting like you were going to get the plague. Like, "Oh, if you don't stretch, you might lose your athleticism." Yeah. And then it wasn't until I think it was 2003. We must find the study there. AIS one.
Yeah, find that. Might have been a little later, but I'll find it.
And so the AIS, we were talking about the media last week and how most of the media is selling your eyeballs to advertisers, selling your attention, except for the ABC, who have more of their thing is to educate, and their mandate, they're paid by the government, paid by our taxes to provide a service. So they're a bit different. And I think in a similar way that the AIS, they're not as interested in publishing research so much as finding out what works best.
Ways to get gold medals.
Yeah, that's their KPI, is gold medals.
Gold medals, world championships, yeah, exactly.
And so they did a study design that was actually quite real world. It was
netballers, I believe.
Netballers, speed over 20 metres, and a group would stretch and do a dynamic warm-up.
And then do the
test. And one group would not stretch, dynamic warm-up test. And they found 0 performance decrement from static stretching.
Exactly the same.
But no one's ever heard about it.
It was a small study, granted it was only a small study.
Because the reason it was a small study, they were using an actual team of athletes rather than some uni students who never do this stuff.
Yeah.
So that's even more valid.
Where to start? Okay. The other thing with those studies, the one not that kind, the first type I mentioned, the one with the 15 minutes of stretching, what they show is an initial drop in performance, and then they'll do a retest at 0, 10, 20, 30, maybe 40 minutes after. And what they find is this: nearly every graph, depending on the time, shows an initial drop of 4 to 8%, and then this steady increase. And almost all of them conclude with, by 30 minutes, there was no reduction in power, or power had returned to normal. Yeah. And so it's like, well, that's your dynamic warm-up right there. Whether you do it or you sit. The time, so the big thing with stretching that people always go, oh, your muscles go to sleep, they're in a coma. Well, no, they're having a tiny little nap.
So again, I'm harping back to the example of that I'm doing with the boomers. So tip-off is at 7:30. My warm-up is, my part of the game day prep is 6:45. And so at that point we're rolling for 5 minutes, we're stretching for 5 minutes. So at 6:55, we are now into our activation and then dynamic.
And then it's ball handling from 7:10 to 7:30.
Yeah, so totally fine. It's so many different things to unpack.
Should we talk about muscle groups and what you should and shouldn't? Because stretching is very nuanced, and often people go, well, they basket all stretches in the bad category.
Yeah.
But there are some stretches we would never do before a game.
Yeah.
And there are some that I'm really
not interested in stretching calves, quads. We should talk about that.
Yeah, so we do what's called the crouching 3. It's linked above or below, depending on your platform. The crouching 3 stretches is a groin stretch, a hip flexor stretch, and then a glute. Well, it's really a piriformis stretch. Yeah. And those little muscles are what we refer to them all the time as the handbrake muscles.
Yeah.
They're little guys that groove compensatory patterns and get overloaded because of sporting demands. So lateral movements.
I should break that down a little bit. So let's say your glute doesn't work perfectly. And you're playing sport, therefore the glute isn't going to extend the hip quite as well. What happens is the brain goes, oh, the glute's not quite giving enough, let's use adductor magnus.
Or hamstrings.
Yep. Let's use them as a substitute to kind of bolster the power and increase stuff.
Yeah, like muscles can kind of pick up the slack for each other.
Except the problem is that the adductor wasn't necessarily designed to do that, and therefore it tightens up. And if you don't,
because of the extra work, the overload.
It's an inappropriate tool for that particular task. If you don't do rolling and stretching, what happens is that extra muscle tightness gets carried through to your next session, and so then you've now got a weak glute and a slightly tighter adductor that by definition is going to be more involved in the contractions and get more lengthening on it because it's tighter in relative terms. So it's getting more stress, and then you're in this loop, and all of a sudden you've got people with really tight groins, and they've got a groin problem or a groin symptom of a glute problem.
Dysfunction, yeah. So the glute is dysfunctional, not doing its job. The adductor picks up the slack, and if you don't reset that adductor each time it's picking up the slack, it gets tighter and tighter and gets more efficient and more effective at picking up the slack and doing the job that's not designed for.
And so the stretch just offers a wonderful reset. You talk best about exactly the mechanism of how that works. Let's go full nerd on that.
Yeah, so then people go, beautiful segue. The next thing people go is they go, well, why don't you just do dynamic, do leg swings and stuff like that. That'll be a topic for another time. But dynamic isn't as effective because you're not fully relaxing and inhibiting this muscle spindle, which is the whole point of a static stretch. So a static stretch, when you lengthen the muscle, you feel that discomfort or that pain sense. And you should never take it to pain. Just take it to that discomfort, that uncomfortable feeling. And if you hold that position, over time that muscle spindle, which is a nerve cell inside the muscle, sends a signal to the spinal cord and says, ow, effectively says that's a stretch. If you hold it for a while, basically that's you telling that muscle spindle to chill out and relax.
This
and
is
be like,
fine.
dude.
No drama.
I got this. Yeah. And so if you do that for, we usually go 25 to 35 seconds, is kind of the sweet spot, about 30 seconds is the sweet spot. You do enough of a turn off that muscle spindle to create some length, but not so much that you put it in a full coma.
And I should say, create length could be misconstrued to restore it to its appropriate length.
Yep.
Because we're not trying to make them into gymnasts, we're not trying to make everyone more flexible, just kind of hit the reset button on the whole body,
put you back to
where it should be.
Basketball or soccer player, netball, or whatever your sport is, put you back to the appropriate length you need.
It's not, the time to do developmental stretching is never pre-competition, pre-training. If you do need to do developmental stretching for your sport.
If you're crazy locked up, for example.
Or if you are karate, judo, there's certain sports where they need gymnastics,
Yep.
also sports where they need to, but you want to separate those out. But anyway, so go on.
So the muscle spindle is then basically inhibited and relaxed by that static stretching. So you just turn him off until that muscle returns to its appropriate resting length.
Yeah.
The problem with dynamic is if you do your leg swing or your high hip something or your pulsing sort of stretches, is you're basically just tapping that muscle spindle, but you're never actually letting it smooth out. It's basically just going out, 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 but never actually gets to get used to and settle into it and then relax out.
And so most of the world has gone down this pathway of based off the assumption that static stretching decreases performance.
Science says static stretching reduces power and performance.
Which it doesn't say. That's an inappropriate interpretation.
That's a global statement about the types of studies they did which were inappropriate based on the real world because they've been exaggerated to get results.
So real world science actually says no problem. You've got to bear that in mind.
Yeah.
And therefore, we have to do dynamic because it's the only form of stretching we can do.
We still need to release things, but we can't do static, so they kind of corral down this path.
Yeah, and dynamic doesn't actually release anything. It warms stuff up, it fires stuff up. It's wonderful. We do it because we go roll, stretch, activate, dynamic. Very, very important. But it's the last phase, and it's there to get you getting that bounce in your body, not the release in the muscle. It's a completely different thing.
The movements you use for releasing and lengthening can't be the same as the movements used for activation and explosiveness.
That would be lovely.
Yeah, if it exists, we're all ears, but it just can't.
It just doesn't.
Because the nervous system is working, we're trying to inhibit the nervous system and then wake it back up at the same time. You've got to separate them out, so you need to stretch and then dynamic.
Yeah. And so it's just another great example of where that superficial glance at it, and then people will kind of push that agenda.
Fancy headlines.
And so the takeaway from the article was very much it doesn't have much of an impact. No one's proven it. Anecdotally, people that are stretching consistently just don't get either they get zero soreness or they get way less soreness. They're able to get into body positions easier. They're able to move.
Soft tissue rates, even though the science on the soft tissue rate and stretching is pretty minimal. What's our soft tissue rate?
And the thing is, the people who are being successful in elite sport, they're not in a massive rush to go and tell all their competitors how to do it. Like if like in AFL, there's a whole bunch of people doing all sorts of things. They're not telling anyone about it because that's
the secret sauce.
Proprietary information that helps you to not get injured, and it's the proprietary information that helps the coach, the high performance coach or the strength and conditioning coach keep their job. So why would you sell that? Give that away to everyone. You're going to be quite likely to just kind of keep it to yourself. We're a little different in the sense that the people. Can you relink the great example about why people don't change their minds?
Remind me afterwards. Yeah.
The people that have got their hearts set on dynamic rules, static sucks. They're not going to change their minds anyway, so I'm fine with sharing it. And it's more about our athletes. To me, the purpose of this is about our athletes and the coaches we work for understanding that there's massive benefits and the negatives are really, really overplayed. And finally, the other thing is, let's just say that you took the argument on face value that the static stretching does decrease that power output. Your power output washes off really rapidly the second you're tired anyway.
Yeah, so 5 minutes into the game.
So every game of sport, the power output might be here the first 3 to 4 minutes, diminishes anyway. Yep. Like there's a wash-off effect just from you're puffed and running around. Like you're not going to jump quite as high. You're probably going to shave off that 2 to 4% just with that alone. But the trade-off of having a team that's vastly more durable, I'll take that. Even if it did, I don't think it does, and I think it's irrelevant. But even if it did, I would still take that deal. That's still a really good deal.
Because anecdotally, soft tissue-wise, not trying to brag or anything, but what's our across our athletes?
I don't know. It's pretty low. We to the extent that when we had someone with a hammy injury, I was like, we need to talk to some people because we haven't actually done much hammy rehab. But
even in our juniors, we just don't get many kids with soft tissue.
Look, I think that might change when we have traditionally trained a lot of basketballs, and it's not as prevalent in basketballs.
Bit of groin, but not really much.
Not heaps.
Not to the degree of soccer.
I think our soccer side of our business is growing really rapidly, as is our footy. And I think as we see more and more of those players, we'll see the true effect of what we're doing in terms of soft tissue. I think it gives a clearer picture.
We've got a poor data set, don't we?
Yeah, we've got a data set that makes it look a bit good, maybe. Or we don't. We won't know.
Time will tell. Part 2.